Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. I'm here, one of my writers, in this case Danny. Thank you, Danny. He's written me a script. Stephen Lawrence, the bungled murder case that shook the UK. I have heard of this. I vaguely know the details. I think this was a little bit before my time. Like, I definitely wasn't an adult, I feel like, when this was happening. But I know about it. I know the name because it's like super famous in the UK, but I don't remember many details. Let's just jump in, shall we? On April the 22nd, 1993, an 18-year-old black student was murdered near a bus stop in Eltham, southeast London, during an encounter with 6 people he'd never previously met. The completely unprovoked attack lasted between 10 and 50 seconds and was carried out by a gang of 6 white thugs who seemed to take exception to a young man of colour daring to wait for a bus on their manor. But unlike other racially motivated murders, which had recently taken place in the UK, this one refused to fall silent after a day or two of media attention. The murder of Stephen Lawrence sent shockwaves throughout the nation over the course of the next 3 decades, which continue to be felt today. Despite the swift identification of 5 of the 6 suspects, it took nearly 20 years for anyone to be found responsible for the murder, whilst the majority of the gang never faced justice at all, and an elusive 6th suspect appeared to remain hidden in the shadows. Why does it take so long to get justice? They have these really interesting gang laws in the UK, where it's like, I can't remember the exact phrasing of the law, but it's something along the lines of, let's say you're in a gang, and you're hanging out with your gang, and you reasonably foresee that one of the gang members could murder someone, which includes killing them with the intent to do grievous bodily harm. That's also murder. Then you, by association, are also guilty of murder. So I don't understand. I believe that's how the law works, and I don't understand why it's so complicated for at least the 5 who were identified to all be guilty of murder. That seems pretty simple. It was a murder at the heart of a bungled investigation, during which some members of an allegedly corrupt police force were more interested in discrediting the victims than catching the killers. It was a murder followed up by a private prosecution, several official inquiries, one of the most controversial newspaper headlines in history, and an eventual retrial which was only made possible after the case sparked the scrapping of an archaic 800-year-old law. And it was a murder which exposed the British police force as an institutionally racist organisation. Yet how did this particularly savage murder, fueled by nothing more than racial hatred, end up changing the landscape of the UK over the next 30 years, whilst other similarly senseless murders were all too quickly forgotten? And has the legacy of Stephen Lawrence proved to be the genuine turning point in race relations that his family has been relentlessly campaigning for all those years? Or do we still have a long, long way to go? I mean, yeah, there's definitely a long way to go. Are things better than they were in the past? Yeah, in my opinion, almost certainly. However, are they fixed or anywhere close to fixed? No, obviously not, because this sort of shit still happens. Now, you might reasonably have expected the random murder of any innocent black person on the streets of the UK to have generated a long-running bit of press coverage back in the 1990s, particularly when it was followed up by blatantly prejudiced police investigation. But the murder of Stephen Lawrence drew much more attention than most. Well, more attention than any, by far, for reasons that we'll attempt to unravel much later. It wasn't always the case that the nation seemed overly concerned by such matters as the murder of a black individual. It was often perceived that the victim was probably a gang member anyway, and so they must have had it coming. Ah yes, racism. The guy is just waiting for a bus. Besides, even if by some long shot they were innocent, the police would be trusted to get to the bottom of it. Whilst I'm pretty certain that the name Stephen Lawrence will be immediately recognised by pretty much everyone in the UK, I'm not so sure that everyone will be familiar with such names as Roland Adams and Michael Menson. No. It's like Stephen Lawrence is the one we all know. And this is just an interesting time to bring this up. Someone's having a go at me on Twitter. Like, I was like just scrolling through and I see like someone's replied to like 700 of my tweets or whatever. Great plan. Although I did see it, so I suppose it was a great plan. And they were like, Simon, I don't believe that you'd never heard of this case before because you proceeded to guess everything correctly. And I'm like, well, I genuinely hadn't, so guess I've just got a giant brain. But it was an American case. And the reality is, like, many Americans listening to this probably don't know the case of Stephen Lawrence. Like, I don't know many famous American cases because often they're nation-specific. Even though we think they're a huge deal, they're often not picked up by international press. Roland was a 15-year-old black student who was also murdered while standing at a bus stop, this time in Thamesmead in southeast London in 1991. Roland had been waiting for the bus with his younger brother when they were both racially harassed by a passing group of older drunk white youths, leading to an attack in which Roland was stabbed in the neck with a butterfly knife and later died from his injuries. Pretty sure butterfly knives are very illegal. They're the knives which, like, you flick out and they're like, whoosh, 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 and they do this kind of, like, weird, like, I don't know, you see people playing with them. But they're, like, there's loads of knife laws in the UK. Like, you kind of flick knives which, like, whoosh, flick out, or the knives that come out of the handle, you know, upwards, like a pop knife or whatever that's called. Or you kind of, I think it's like 3 inches is the maximum size of a blade that you can carry around. The police and the Crown Prosecution Service were both reluctant to treat the murder as racially motivated, seeming... It's like, yeah, what was the racial harassment that they were doing before? It's like, no, that's unrelated to the murder. Is it Crown Prosecution Service? Is it really? Seemingly working on the pretext that black boys can't be entirely innocent. Ah, yes, it's good old-fashioned racism. It was initially determined that Rowland had lost his life in a fight over gang territory, which had spiraled out of control. Members of the British National Party later congratulated the group of attackers for defending their territory. Yeah, I mean, look, the British National Party, or BNP, is just an enormous pile of shit, in my opinion. No, I think it's pretty objective fact that the British National Party is a pile of shit, and anyone who supports it's a piece of shit. So I think we can all just agree on that. In fact, Roland Adams had never been a gang member. He was a dedicated young student and a talented musician who had been set upon by a group of drunken racists on the grounds that he was black. Only one member of the gang was sentenced for murder, whilst none of the others were even prosecuted. Meanwhile, Michael Menson already had a reasonably high profile, as it enjoyed a brief brush with fame as part of the dance record production trio Double Trouble in the late 1980s. The son of a Ghanaian diplomat, Michael suffered from psychiatric problems in later life. In 1997, at the age of 30, he was randomly attacked, abused, and eventually set alight and killed by a large group of attackers, only 2 of whom were ever jailed for murder. What the fuck? How have I never heard of this? Before he died from his horrific burns, Michael had managed to reveal the nature of the attack to his family and friends, but the police had initially refused to take their claims seriously. As Michael had been suffering from mental health issues, they were just keen to wrap this one up as suicide on the assumption that he must have set himself on fire. Police, do your fucking job. Jesus Christ. How did this not get more attention? Like, he's the son of a diplomat, and he's famous for being a part of a band. How on earth do you get away with this? There had long been a growing sense of fury that people of colour were rarely treated fairly by the police in life or death, and this anger had already boiled over into the streets during the infamous Brixton riots of 1981. In a heavy-handed bid to cut down on crime in the South London district with a large African-Caribbean community, the police had launched Operation Swamp 81, which essentially amounted to stopping and searching any person of colour they encountered for no compelling reason. This sparked massive riots, during which 45 members of the public and 279 police officers were injured, almost 150 buildings were damaged, countless shops were looted, and over 100 vehicles were destroyed. I mean, like, all of this is wrong, but like the stop and search and stuff that's like racially profiling is just, it's not okay. But neither's looting and setting buildings on fire, but what a fucking mess. The subsequent inquiry, overseen by Lord Scarman, concluded that racial disadvantages, complex social and economic factors, and deep mistrust of the police and their dubious methods had fueled a spontaneous outburst of resentment. Yeah, it's not a deep mistrust of the police. I wonder why they've got that. Probably because the police don't seem to be doing their jobs at all. I mean, unless the people are white, then they'll do a great job. But for black people, not so much. Whilst the Scarman report warned that urgent positive action was required to tackle racial disadvantage, raise confidence in the police, and reduce the risk of further violent protests, it would be difficult to argue that tensions between the police and ethnic communities dramatically simmered in the wake of the report. And it was against this backdrop of mistrust and unease and violence that Stephen Lawrence was born and raised. The eldest of 3 children, Stephen Lawrence was born in 1974 to Jamaican parents Neville and Doreen, who had arrived in the UK in the 1960s. Raised in Plumstead in southeast London, Stephen was a keen scout and reportedly excelled at sports, whilst harbouring an ambition to become an architect. In later years, he also had a blink-and-you'll-miss-him appearance on the silver screen when he appeared as an extra in the 1988 Denzel Washington crime drama, The Queen and Country. His classmates remember Stephen as being a particularly conscientious and responsible student. His close friend, Dwayne Brooks, recalls an incident in which some scoundrel smashed a classroom window behind the teacher's back, prompting the teacher to drag Stephen to the front of the class to accuse him of vandalism. This was not because the teacher genuinely believed Stephen to be the culprit. It was a bit of a shitty tactic, which was designed to get the most trustworthy boy in class to avert a miscarriage of justice by revealing the real wrongdoer. Oh no, that's just going to get him beaten up. You're like, yo, Stephen, is this you? No, it wasn't me. It was Peter. And then Peter's going to be like, you're going to get a pounding, Stephen. But that's not how it panned out. Stephen refused to sing like a canary, possibly because he didn't even know who had smashed the damn window. This earned him the respect of his classmates for not being a snitch, but he was left seething at how he was treated. Now, it's very easy to get a bit carried away when we're talking about the virtues and the potential of an innocent victim whose life was snatched away by no fault of their own. It's not quite the same with criminals who are at best only likely to get a character summary from a distant neighbour, which runs along the lines of, well, he kept himself to himself, really. We could never have dreamed that he was capable of doing something like this. In contrast, murder victims are often painted as utterly angelic beings who enriched the lives of everyone they touched and who were just on the cusp of finding a cure for cancer or inventing the teleporter or persuading Justin Bieber to retire. All brilliant things that should be done as soon as possible, especially the latter. In the case of Stephen Lawrence, he's often depicted as a thoroughly dedicated student and peacemaker who was on the brink of becoming a world-famous architect just before his life was taken. Now, maybe he was destined to become a world-famous architect, and we'll never know. That's the tragedy. He'd certainly just completed a brief work placement at a small architecture firm, and he was taking his A-levels in technology and physics. But he was never top of the class, and some of his teachers were worried that he needed to seriously knuckle down if he stood any chance of passing the grade. He had naturally become more interested in hanging out with friends than burying his nose in books all weekends, and his parents were getting increasingly upset with him that he was no longer attending worship at Trinity Methodist Church as frequently as he did when he was dragged along by his ears as a small kid. Yeah, I mean, pro tip here. If you want your kids to do something, don't, be too pressuring on it. Because it's just, they're not going to be into that. I was never forced to go to church, although now I just don't know. I was forced to go to church because I went to a religious school. And now it's like, I don't go to church at all. I'm not religious at all, so that kind of makes sense. But you know what I mean? It's like, don't pressure your kids into doing things they don't want to do because they're going to resent you for it. Stephen Lawrence didn't walk around with a halo hovering above his head. And of course, as soon as you start suggesting that a victim wasn't an angel, some people instinctively prepare to hear the details of that time a victim spent years in Borstal after burning down a dog rescue shelter while off their head on heroin. I'm not suggesting anything like that at all. By all accounts, Stephen Lawrence was probably more clean living than most and never once had a brush with the law. He certainly wasn't getting up to the kind of stuff that I was getting up to at the age of 18. All I'm saying is that he was not some mythical superhero. He was a perfectly normal human being who occasionally experienced the kind of conflict and tension at home and at school that many of us did. He was a popular, fun-loving student who in no way deserved to be murdered by a group of complete strangers whilst he was trying to catch the bus home. Although Stephen Lawrence was widely reported to be a positive and upbeat student, life wasn't always easy for a young black kid growing up in southeast London in the 1980s. He had occasionally been the target of racial abuse at school and on the streets, including in one instance in which he was randomly spat at while minding his own business. I don't even know what to say. I'm just a super white dude, so I have no experience of this, but it's f***ed up, isn't it? As he was growing older, he became more interested in exploring the problems encountered by members of ethnic communities on a daily basis. Following the murder of 15-year-old Roland Adams in 1991, Stephen announced his intention to attend a protest march against the woefully inadequate police handling of the matter in Thamesmead. The idea didn't sit well with his parents, who at this point preferred to keep their heads down instead of getting actively involved in this kind of thing. I mean, yeah, that's what older people tend to do. They're just like, oh, keep your head down. But fortunately, we have young people who go out and protest this kind of stuff, which is good. But Stephen defied their wishes and attended the march anyway, which passed without incident. 1993 was a tough year for the Lawrence family, and for Father Neville in particular, who was a carpenter but had recently found himself out of work. But still, Stephen was in generally good spirits and living life to the full. His friend, Leon Thompson, described the very last time he saw him. Stephen was feeling over the moon because he'd just hooked up with a girl and was excited to meet up with her for an official first date the following Saturday. On Thursday, April the 22nd, 1993, just 2 days before that first date was meant to take place, the Lawrence household was a bit quieter than usual. Mother Doreen worked as a special needs teacher, but this week she was taking a rare excursion from home to attend a course in Birmingham, which formed part of the humanities degree that she was taking at Greenwich University. Stephen got up in the morning, as usual, to attend classes and enjoyed a cup of tea with his father before setting off. His then unemployed father, Neville, later admitted that Stephen had picked up on how low he was feeling that morning about his situation and worried Stephen had asked his dad a few times if he was sure he was okay before heading off for class. The final promise that Stephen made to his father was that he'd be back at 10:30 p.m. After lessons finished for the afternoon, Stephen headed off to his Uncle Martin's house in Grove Park, accompanied by his good buddy, Dwayne Brooks. The pair played video games until late in the evening. They weren't remotely interested in drinking alcohol or taking drugs or getting up to the kind of mischief that many typical young adults of all creeds, myself included, would have found too irresistible to turn down. Yeah, I don't know, I was probably more like Stephen. Daddy sounds like a bit of a naughty rebel. I was just like, nah, I'll just be playing video games with my mates. I did drink a bit, but not crazy. I wasn't crazy. They just wanted to play video games in the privacy of Uncle Martin's house and then get home safely. They lost track of time and left it a bit late to guarantee Stephen getting back in time for 10:30 p.m. It was hardly a major crisis. It's not like the 18-year-old Stephen was on some kind of strict curfew, and it wouldn't have been the first time that he came home later than intended. His father, Neville, wouldn't have initially been too concerned that his son had drifted from the schedule. Yeah, I mean, he's 18 years old. Like, I'd go out with my mates and it'd be like, yeah, I'll be back, late. And sometimes it'd get pretty late. I don't think my parents were particularly concerned. But also, I wasn't a black kid in London. I was a white kid in the countryside. So, a little bit of a different situation there. But Stephen still seemed to make an effort to get home at a reasonable time, particularly as his mother was away and his father had seemed a bit down that morning. Stephen and Dwayne swiftly hopped onto the 286 bus, but then quickly realised they'd made a schoolboy error as the bus took a long-winded route, which would take ages to get anywhere near Stephen's house. So they made a fateful decision to get off the bus on Wellhall Road in Eltham and wait there at the stop for an alternative bus, which took a more direct route home. 3 other people were waiting at the same stop, but there didn't appear to be any immediate sign of a bus, and Stephen was becoming a little frustrated. Shortly after the clock struck 10:30 p.m, Stephen began wandering to the end of the road to see if there were signs at all of an imminent ride home. It was at this point that the lone figure came into the sight of 6 white men who seemed aggrieved that a young person of colour was wandering around in their neck of the woods. At least one of this pack was carrying a knife. Dwayne called out to Stephen to ask if he could see the bus coming. Within seconds, the gang of 6 had swarmed around Stephen whilst hurling racial slurs, prompting Dwayne to run in the opposite direction while screaming at his friends to follow him. The attack was believed at the time to have lasted just a few seconds, but it was later revealed that it may have extended for as long as 50. At some point, after Stephen had been forced to the ground, a knife was plunged into his left shoulder and right collarbone, severing his axillary arteries and penetrating his lung. One of the attackers fled the scene into a nearby neighbourhood. Stephen made a valiant attempt to get to his feet and run towards his friends, but he could only make it about 200 yards before collapsing to the ground. Dwayne had managed to reach a telephone box and call for an ambulance, after which he desperately began to shout for help and flag down passing vehicles, attracting the attention of a couple walking home and an off-duty police officer who covered Lawrence with a blanket. The ambulance arrived within a few minutes, and Stephen Lawrence was taken to Brook Hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. Even before Stephen had been pronounced dead, there were already disturbing issues emerging regarding the immediate response of the police and how both Stephen and Dwayne had been treated. A police car had actually turned up shortly before the ambulance, but no emergency first aid was administered to Stephen. Many of the officers who arrived later had no idea what they were even attending was a murder scene, and no logs or records were initially created. So far, sloppy police work. Don't know why they wouldn't administer first aid, but so far, benefit of the doubt from me. I get the feeling that it's going to change substantially, but this could just be sloppy policing. Like, not negligent policing, allegedly, in my opinion. There was an initial assumption that Stephen and Dwayne had both been involved in either a fight or some kind of dubious criminal activity which had led to this outcome. Again, not an unreasonable assumption. Like, just someone being randomly attacked seems like less common than people getting into fights, right? As Dwayne tried in vain to explain what exactly had happened, he was dismissed as hysterical and viewed as a potential threat by police officers who at one point threatened to handcuff him. And although an eyewitness had pointed the police in the exact direction of where the group of attackers had fled, a decision was made not to search the area or carry out house-to-house visits as it was felt that it was a bit late in the evening and some residents might be trying to get some sleep. Bro, someone's been murdered. That's crazy. Get after it. And nobody wants to be woken up on a Thursday night just because 2 black kids have been causing trouble again on the streets. Jesus Christ. From the very beginning, Stephen's parents, Neville and Doreen, weren't exactly treated with the levels of sympathy or respect that you might expect after your 18-year-old son has just been murdered on the streets. Shortly before they viewed the body at the hospital, they were told by the inspector, "We've got a young lad in there. He's dead. We don't know who he is. If he's not your son, then all well and good. But we need to know." Jesus Christ, man. I know it's like doctors should have bedside manner, but so police officers need to also have some bedside manner. That's pretty wild. After the body had been identified, the police started asking Neville and Doreen blunt questions about Stephen's character and his background. The just bereaved parents were left with an impression that the police were only interested in figuring out what Stephen could have done to cause this or which rival gang he could have crossed. Wow, just like straight up assumption that because he's an 18-year-old black kid in London that he's in a gang? Hell. The police were given no information whatsoever on any potential progress into identification of the suspects. In later interviews, police officers involved in the investigation reported that the investigation was met with a wall of silence from the public, perhaps an indication that local residents feared consequences if they dared to speak up. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. People were practically queuing up outside the Eltham police station to hand over the name of the suspects. Quite aside from the witnesses standing at the bus stop and the passers-by who stopped to help, there were dozens of other witnesses who came forward with a short list of names of the members of the gang who had just murdered Stephen Lawrence. Within just hours of Stephen's death, the first telephone call came in early the next morning from an anonymous guy who gave the names of members of a racist knife-wielding gang who were known to threaten the local neighborhood. Yeah, it's like, oh, people were afraid. Well, anonymous tips totally work. That's fine, just call in and tip them off anonymously. You'll be fine. Later that same day, a young skinhead walked into the police station with the names of the gang members that he claimed he knew to be responsible. The details were given to Detective Constable Christopher Budgeon, who in turn rushed them to Detective Inspector Benjamin Bullock, the man who was second in command of the whole investigation. It was later revealed at an inquiry that the information had been largely dismissed, mostly, it seems, because the detective inspector didn't like the detective constable very much. Professionalism right there, isn't it? That's a good one. Detective Constable Christopher Budgeon later observed, "I could have recovered the crown jewels, and it would not have made any difference." Still, dozens more witnesses came forward, albeit by some fairly unconventional methods. For example, an anonymous note was left on the windscreen of a police car, whilst another anonymous letter was found in a telephone kiosk. The latter gave a list of names, which concluded with the warning, "Approach those streets with care." But whilst the identity of the potential sixth attacker, a man often described as the fair-haired attacker, remained elusive for now, the same 5 names kept popping up repeatedly in dozens of tip-offs. David Norris, Gary Dobson, brothers Neil and Jamie Acquittal, and Luke Knight. All 5 were aged between 16 and 17, and many of them had already been linked to earlier racially motivated attacks in the local area. Little was known about Luke Knight at the time, as he appeared to have kept his head largely under the radar. But Neil Acquittal was seen as the leader of the gang, whilst younger brother Jamie Acquittal may have been seen as his deputy. Some say they thought they were the Cray twins as they strutted around a neighborhood that they believed belonged to them. The younger Jamie had already been excluded from school at the age of 14 after kicking a black pupil down the school staircase and being found with a monkey wrench in his backpack that he intended to use in a planned fight after school with a gang of black pupils. David Norris was living in a luxury mock-up Tudor mansion in a gated community at the time, largely thanks to his dad Clifford, who just happened to be a drug baron with alleged police connections, locally known as the Godfather of Eltham. Jesus, this guy sounds scary. Can you imagine it? It's like, you live in this nice community, it's like a gated community, everything, and it's just like, you know, middle class, upper middle class or whatever, just like a professional. And then it's like, oh, whose house is that? Oh, that's the drug baron's. He's scary. David Norris had also been expelled from school, in this case for uncontrollable violent behaviour. If you're expelled from school, though, don't you have to go to another school? Like, because you have to be in school. You can't not be in school at 14, or is this just some, like, people often say how ignorant I am of how things work. And this is genuinely something I'm curious about, because my sister's a teacher and her husband's a teacher, and they work at a state school, public school, as you say them in the US, and they find it's very hard to expel people. Like, because they have to be in school, and if you're expelling them, you're just making them someone else's problem. They're saying it's almost impossible, and the kids know this, and it can be a problem. Meanwhile, Gary Dobson's dad also had connections with the police, but that's because he was a former police officer. Along with other members of the gang, Gary Dobson had also been linked with previous local racially motivated violence, including an attack on a man called Gurdy Bungie, who was stabbed whilst working at Wimpy Bar just a month before Stephen Lawrence was murdered. Gurdy Bungie was lucky to survive the incident and later recognized Gary Dobson as one of the people involved in the attack, but the case was dropped due to a lack of evidence, following what Gurdy Bungie believed to be a half-hearted investigation. Yeah, dude. It's like, no, that's the dude. That's the dude who was in the gang who stabbed me. And they're like, oh, well, we don't really have enough to go on, so we're not going to look into that much further. Pass me a donut. However, the police had now 5 obvious suspects to interrogate in the case of Stephen Lawrence, and so the obvious course of action might have been to arrest them all on grounds of reasonable suspicion. Hell yes! But no. Instead, the senior investigating officer, Detective Superintendent Brian Whedon, decided to just place them all under surveillance for a couple of weeks. Okay, I mean, not bad. Not bad. It's not the worst thing possible, is it? I'm sure there was a reason he did this, to, see if to not tip his hand or something. Please tell me it's that. It later turned out that Brian Whedon was unaware that he even had the power to arrest the group on reasonable suspicion alone. Bro, you're a police officer. Come on. You should know this stuff. During the 1998 public inquiry, he revealed, "I have never before in any murder case arrested anyone for murder without evidence as opposed to information." Well, I mean, evidence and information are kind of like related, aren't they? Information can be evidence. Does that even make sense? What was your name? Brian? Michael Mansfield, the lawyer working on behalf of the Lawrence family, appeared quite incredulous when he responded with, "Do you not find it rather disturbing that it has taken all this time for you to recognize a fairly basic tenet of criminal law?" Brian Weed admitted, "I think it's regrettable." Brian, did you miss like a day of training or something? Because that seems like something you really should know. Still, perhaps the surveillance team would uncover some of the evidence that Brian Whedon felt was required before bothering the suspects with an interview. No, scrap that too. The surveillance operation was a massive show. It took a while for the cameras to be set up in the first place, as the photographers apparently didn't want to work over the weekends. During that lost time, witnesses reported that the police had already missed the sight of an unknown man loitering around one of the suspects' home with what appeared to be a black plastic bag crammed full of clothes. During the actual surveillance, the undercover police themselves spotted Neil Aycourt emerging from his house with black bin bags, which he threw in a car before driving off. What do these black bin bags have anything to do with this? Like, it's not like Stephen Lawrence disappeared. They didn't take his clothes. He was just stabbed. So what's this got to do with that? The police elected to stay put and continued their surveillance of the house, and they couldn't call for any backup to ensure that Neil Aycourt's car was followed, as they hadn't been given any means of communication whatsoever. Brilliant. Genius work there, guys. In short, the suspects had potentially been given a whole fortnight to leisurely dispose of any evidence that might link them to the murder scene. Oh, of course, I'm being so dim. I'm really dim. Like, of course, the clothes are going to be the clothes they wear. I'm always saying, like, criminals are stupid, and I'm like, no, why would they throw away my clothes? They're not his clothes. And it's like, well, obviously, because they could contain evidence and stuff like that. You got to burn everything you wore. God, sort of thing I'd think I would know by now. Whilst the police watched them come and go with overflowing bin bags and did nothing to intervene. I suppose the suspects could have just been getting rid of their garden waste, but it would have been handy to know for sure. It's little wonder that Stephen's parents weren't entirely impressed by how the investigation had been conducted so far. On the 4th of May 1993, they gave a press conference in which they vented their frustration at how the police appeared to know who was behind the murder, but were doing nothing to bring them to justice. Just a couple of days later, Neville and Doreen met up with Nelson Mandela at his own request. Okay, the president of the African National Congress already had a packed schedule on his final day of his visit to the UK, but he'd asked to meet up with Neville and Doreen for a private 20-minute meeting at the Athenaeum Hotel in Mayfair, London. Nelson Mandela later told the press that he knew what it meant to lose a child under tragic circumstances, and he compared the racial tension in the UK to the brutality of South Africa, where, quote, black lives are cheap. Doreen Lawrence publicly pondered at the same press call, quote, "Why is it that a leader from a foreign country shows us sympathy when our own government has expressed no interest at all?" In response, Alton Police sniffily declared that they thought the investigation was progressing quite well. Sure it is. There did finally appear to be a bit of progress a fortnight after the murder, when it was announced that 4 of the suspects had been arrested. David Lawrence, the son of a wealthy drug baron, had actually turned himself in under strict instructions by his lawyer not to answer any questions. So what was the point of turning yourself in? Are you just going to sit there in silence? Gary Dobson and both the Aycourt brothers were arrested by the police at their homes on May the 7th, while the 5th suspect, Luke Knight, was eventually arrested the following month on June the 4th. A collection of knives and assorted weapons were also seized from some of the homes of the suspects. Charges of murder were only brought against Neil Aycourt and Luke Knight after Stephen's friend Dwayne Brooks picked them both out as part of an identity parade. It looked as if we might finally be getting somewhere. But then, all of the charges was swiftly dropped after the Crown Prosecution Service declared that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. Dwayne's identification of the 2 suspects he may have only glimpsed briefly in the dark whilst running in the opposite direction would not be enough to secure a conviction, and the police had picked up literally no other compelling evidence which connected the suspects to the murder. I don't think it's the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, is failing here. They just have to make an assessment and they're like, there's not enough evidence. And it's on the police's side to gather that evidence and present it to the CPS. It didn't help that the only other 3 potential eyewitnesses who were standing at the bus stop, 2 local men and a French au pair, all gave very vague and conflicting statements on what they'd seen that night. Stephen's parents were informed that the case had been dropped at around the same time they were burying their son in a family plot in Jamaica next to his great-grandmother. They had decided against burying him in the UK over fears that the grave would be desecrated. It saddens me to say it, but they probably had the right idea. Who the f*** is going to be desecrating that grave? That's f***ed up. And I mean, we know the answer, like racists, but doesn't make it any less f***ed up, does it? In 1995, a memorial plaque for Stephen was set into the pavement at the spot of his death on West Hall Road in Eltham, but it has been the target of vandalism at least 3 times. Whoever did this, you fucking depraved clowns. Much later, in 2008, Doreen officially opened the Stephen Lawrence Centre in Deptford, southeast London, a state-of-the-art teaching centre devoted to architecture, urban design, and engineering. Whilst the centre is still very much open for business today, 8 of the building's windows were smashed within just a week of the opening day. I don't understand. Neville and Doreen Lawrence weren't about to give up just yet, or indeed at any other point over the next 30 years. As the state prosecution had got them precisely nowhere, they decided to launch a private prosecution against the 5 suspects. A private criminal prosecution is a relatively rare event, which is initiated by private citizens or organisations as opposed to the CPS. This case, in which the family were represented by Michael Mansfield QC, would be the very first private prosecution in the UK for a racially motivated attack. Of course, pursuing a private prosecution was not going to come cheap. The Lawrence family weren't exactly rolling in money, and the private nature of the prosecution meant that they were obviously never going to be entitled to legal aid. But a fundraising campaign, launched in 1994, resulted in a flood of donations pouring in from the public, whilst many legal professionals, quite staggeringly, offered their services for free. I don't think it's that staggering. Like, lawyers do a ton of pro bono work. And this sounds like a really good case to take up, because it just does, doesn't it? By April 1996, the private prosecution was all set to go. But as you may have already suspected, the Lawrence family did not get the outcome that they were pinning their hopes on. For starters, the charges against 2 of the suspects, David Norris and Jamie Acquittal, had already been dropped before the trial had even begun due to a complete lack of evidence. This meant that only David Norris, Neil Acquittal, and Luke Knight were facing charges of murder at the Central Criminal Court, all 3 pleading not guilty. The latter 2 were the faces picked out by Dwayne Brooks during the identity parade, but a further blow was struck to the prosecution when Dwayne Brooks was deemed to be unreliable. In comparison to Stephen Lawrence, Dwayne Brooks had struggled in recent years after leaving school with poor results and then moving out to his family home to shuffle between various hostels. His good friend Stephen had always been incredibly supportive during this rocky period and had tried to help Dwayne in any way he could. But the police didn't seem to like or trust Dwayne Brooks very much, as was evidenced at the actual murder scene when they viewed him as a threat and considered handcuffing him. Straight after the identification parade, Dwayne had been given a lift home by DS Christopher Crawley, who later alleged during this journey that Dwayne had quietly confided to him that he now wasn't so sure if he'd picked out the correct faces at all. Dwayne has always categorically denied saying any such thing. But after giving somewhat befuddled testimony during the trial in which he gave confusing and conflicting descriptions of the event, the judge, Mr. Justice Curtis, deemed him to be an unreliable witness, which meant that his evidence was inadmissible. And I mean, yeah, if his testimony is, clearly confused, then he does seem like an unreliable witness, which is seriously unfortunate. Of course, just as in the original case brought by the Crown Prosecution Service, the evidence of Dwayne Brooks wouldn't have been enough to secure convictions anyway, and the problem remained that there was practically nothing else to go on. Whilst the clothing of both the victim and all the suspects had been analysed extensively using the best methods available at the time, there was no blood found on the clothing of any of the suspects, which was concluded to have come from Stephen. Yeah, but like we said, what was in those bags? As Stephen had been wearing several layers of clothing on the night, these would most likely have cleaned the blade of the knife as it was withdrawn twice from the body during the stabbing, which meant that there would have been very little scope for any of Stephen's blood to get transferred onto his attackers anyway. In a special report written for the Lawrence family by forensic scientist Professor Angela Gallup, the professor conceded that there was no scientific evidence to connect the suspects with the murder, but she also concluded that this was hardly surprising given the extraordinary delay between the murder and the initial arrests. A fortnight's a pretty long window of time in which the suspects... A fortnight, by the way, Americans, is 2 weeks. I know that's something that we just use in Britain, I believe. A pretty long window of time in which suspects could have disposed of the most damning evidence at their convenience. If they'd really had their wits about them, they could have just shoved most of the clothes they were wearing on that night into black plastic bags, perhaps pausing only to give a friendly wave to the undercover detectives sitting uselessly in their cars. Yes, maybe it'd been a good idea to have acted a little bit quicker, police. I'm not saying that's what happened at all. It's just clear that the delay between the murder and the arrests wasn't ideal in terms of collecting crucial evidence. The murder trial lasted just 1 week, during which all 3 suspects had refused to speak. Mr. Justice Curtis wrapped things up very quickly when he directed the jury to deliver a not-guilty verdict for all 3 defendants, citing the unreliability of Dwayne Brooks and the lack of any other evidence. Not only did this mean that the 3 suspects had been acquitted of murder, it also meant that they could never be tried again for the same crime under the UK's double jeopardy law. Wait, really? Even if there's more evidence that comes forward? That's pretty wild. I thought double jeopardy was like a legend. Regular casual criminalist viewers with a good memory, which hasn't been addled by alcohol or kebab abuse, may remember that we discussed the US version of Double Jeopardy during the Paul Werner Powell, the man who sent himself to the electric chair video. The principle behind this whole procedural defense is that no defendant should ever be tried twice for the same crime if they've been acquitted of the charges. This is partly to avoid risk of entirely innocent people facing constant persecution from individuals who are wealthy enough to keep dragging them back to court to repeatedly defend the same false charges. Yeah, because they can just bring private prosecutions and continue to do that, which would be really unpleasant. In the US, this is a constitutional right, which is clearly referenced in the Fifth Amendment, and a very similar double jeopardy law is applied in the UK. So essentially, that meant that David Norris, Neil Aycourt, and Luke Knight hadn't just won the latest round of a legal battle, it meant they could never be tried again for the murder of Stephen Lawrence. Even if, it turns out, oh no, we invented a time machine and we went back in time and saw that it was you using our magical time machine. That wouldn't be enough to get them back into court and in prison. In the immediate aftermath of the acquittals, Doreen Lawrence angrily argued, quote, "We will never know if we had enough evidence or not because the jury were never given the opportunity to make that judgment. The judge directed them to return a verdict of not guilty." This isn't on the courts. The courts are just dealing with what they have been given evidence-wise, and that's what the justice is doing, and it's not wrong. They're doing what they do. In all fairness, though, while it's understandable that the Lawrence family were upset and frustrated at the outcome, you don't have to be a qualified law expert to recognize that the lack of evidence in this case had forced the judge into making that direction. It's debatable if Dwayne Brooks, a traumatized young man who had recently seen the brutal murder of his best friend, should have been so quickly dismissed as an unreliable witness, but the prosecution still required stronger evidence, yet even if he hadn't, it would not have been enough. While the blame for this lack of evidence may well sit in the laps of the Eltham police, who were too busy watching the suspects drive away into the distance with black plastic bags to provide anything of real value to the prosecution, the fact remains that Mr. Justice Curtis couldn't realistically have directed the jury in any other way. Yeah, this isn't Curtis's fault. This is the Eltham police's fault. The police decided to keep going, though. Perhaps surprisingly, they launched a second investigation in 1997, during which they planted a covert camera in Gary Dobson's flat, where the gang members were known to regularly hang out. I say surprising, because even if they managed to capture footage of either David Norris, Neil Aycourt, or Luke Knight blatantly confessing to the murder, it would have been too late to do anything about it now that they had been acquitted. Maybe they were pinning their hopes on at least getting something out of the other two suspects, Gary Dobson and Jamie Aycourt. On the whole, the second investigation didn't really lead anywhere. Much of the captured surveillance footage depicted a group of utterly vile men wielding knives and discussing in the crudest terms how exactly they would torture and kill black people and policemen. Jesus Christ. People are fucking horrible. One of the most notable portions of the footage was a segment in which Gary Dobson appears to recall a violent incident involving a black man in a wimpy bar. Now, this sounds very similar to the incident in which Gurdy Bangai claims he was stabbed by a group that included Dobson just a month before the murder of Stephen Lawrence. But although we'll return to the surveillance footage, known as the Footscray footage, after the name of the road in which it was filmed, it has to be said that nothing was recorded which conclusively linked any of the suspects to any specific crime. However, a rather more conclusive result was declared in 1997 when the long-delayed inquest into Stephen's murder was finally completed. The 5 suspects had appeared at the inquest, but all of them had refused to utter a single word, claiming privilege against self-incrimination. But the findings of the inquest jury were quite shockingly specific. They didn't just conclude that Stephen Lawrence had been the victim of an unlawful killing, they delivered a verdict that he had been murdered in a completely unprovoked racist attack by 5 white youths. Aside from actually mentioning the names of the 5 white youths, you can't get much more explicit than that. No, but it's also what we know happened. Pretty much. It's not like this didn't happen, it's just there's not enough evidence to link the people who did it to the crime. Then the very next day, the Daily Mail newspaper went one step further and put together one of the most sensational and controversial newspaper front pages in history. Well, it is the Daily Mail. It's one of the things that they do. It's kind of a rag newspaper. Now I should point out that I'm not usually a fan of the Daily Mail. The notoriously right-wing, scaremongering newspaper usually has a reputation for printing inaccurate stories about how Muslims are trying to cancel Christmas, how benefit scroungers are cheating the system whilst living in mansions fueled by the taxpayer, and how your job is at immediate risk of illegal immigrants who are arriving in boats by the millions every day. Yeah, Danny summarised the Daily Mail there brilliantly. But on this occasion, in February 1997, I have to concede that the Daily Mail took quite an extraordinarily risky and courageous approach to their front page. Then editor Paul Dacher made the decision to slap photographs of all 5 suspects on the front page under the bold headline, "Murderers." Holy sh**, that is a statement. I don't know what the civil laws are there, but that feels like you could be opening yourself up to some mega legal trouble. This was accompanied by the subheadline, "The Mail accuses these men of killing. If we're wrong, let them sue us." Oh my god, Daily Mail, fucking good for you. While some of the mothers of the suspects did start making a few noises about threatening to sue, no legal action was ever instigated against the Daily Mail. Oh my god. Because of course, for it to be libelous or slander or whatever, it has to be proven to be false or something like that, right? And then it would be like, oh no, people are going to go digging way too hard. And we don't want people digging. And we know why they didn't want people digging, allegedly. And as Doreen Lawrence observed, their silence is more eloquent than any denial. She also later praised the newspaper for having the balls to go with such a provocative headline and gave credit to editor Paul Dacher for helping to keep the story in the hearts and minds of the public. Yeah, I mean, it's not often I say this, but Daily Mail win right there. She said, "The front page made a lasting impression on our struggle for justice. It made everyone in Britain listen to us and support our fight." I fucking love this. I can't get over, it always blows my mind. This is the Daily Mail. It's like, fucking yes. What had prompted the usually repugnant publication to take such a gamble with a daring front page accusation that could potentially have led them to paying out massive libel damages? Paul Dacher would have you believe that this was a healthy example of an independent and self-regulating newspaper taking a stand for the greater good. But he also admits that he may never have run the headline at all if Stephen's father Neville hadn't just carried out some plastering work at his home, which by all accounts was excellent. So good work, Neville. I mean, yeah, he's the editor of the paper, but I'm sure he used to be a journalist before maybe editors of paper are still journalists. But he got promoted from being a journalist to being an editor, probably, right? And so he's used to picking up stories where he finds them. And then he picked up a story from his home life. That's totally fine and awesome. Good for you. I mad respect. Mad respect. However, with 3 of the suspects now acquitted and no significant progress made in subsequent investigations, attention now turned to how exactly the police had managed to make such a mess of all of this. The Lawrence family made a formal complaint to the Police Complaints Authority in 1997 over the conduct of the investigation, which they felt had not been handled properly because of Stephen Lawrence's race. They argued that the police simply couldn't seem to comprehend that a black teenager could be a completely innocent victim. A later report conducted by the independent authority concluded that while there were significant weaknesses, omissions, and lost opportunities, that's a quote, during the course of the investigation, there was no evidence whatsoever of any racist conduct from police officers. Just one officer, Detective Inspector Ben Bullock, faced disciplinary action of any kind when he was put before a tribunal on 13 charges relating to neglect of duty. He was ultimately cleared of 11 of those charges and was found guilty of just 2 of them: failure to properly brief officers searching the homes of suspects and failure to investigate an anonymous letter. Yeah, that's not going to be any serious trouble, is it? That's not good enough. However, Detective Inspector Ben Bullock just happened to retire the day after the tribunal. It's like the movies, isn't it? I expect your letter of resignation on my desk in the morning. It's like, you're not getting fired, but you are. Allegedly, in my opinion. And his punishment amounted to no more than a caution relating to a job from which he had just stepped down. The Metropolitan Police Force issued a cheerful statement in which they stated that Ben Bullock had been largely vindicated by the tribunal. Technically correct. In contrast, Neville and Doreen Lawrence believed that Ben Bullock had been guilty of all 13 charges and described the tribunal as a whitewash. Doreen told the press, quote, "We knew nothing was ever going to come out of it. I'm surprised that the tribunal found Bullock guilty of anything. He will retire with a very good pension. He will never be punished." But during the very same year, it was announced that the police were destined to face a far deeper scrutiny than the one from the complaints department. And this was largely down to a change in government. Under the Conservative government, which had been closing down mines and stealing milk from school children since 1979, the Home Secretary, Michael Howard, had shown little interest in the case of Stephen Lawrence and had refused to even meet the parents. That all changed quite dramatically when the Labour Party won a landslide victory in 1997. This is when I first started realising that politics was a thing. I was 10 in 1997, and I remember Labour billboards. I remember Labour having a huge win. And I remember the name Michael Howard. I don't know much about him. But yeah, this was kind of when I first started not paying attention. I was 10, but being aware that there were elections and such things. While they didn't quite reopen the mines or give the milk back to the school children, so they lost my vote straight away. Yes, Daddy, let's reopen the mines. Look, I'm not saying that wasn't a really intense time in history that made a lot of people very miserable and out of work. But also, I'm kind of glad that the UK's not mining shit anymore, because the economy would be about primary industries, which just, for a small island, doesn't make a lot of sense when there's a lot of other mine shit coming from abroad where they've got a lot more of it. But the new Home Secretary, Jack Straw, was clearly a lot more concerned about what exactly had gone wrong during the Stephen Lawrence murder case. After taking the time to actually meet with the parents of the teenager who was murdered 4 years earlier, he announced a judicial inquiry into the killing and the subsequent investigation, which would be overseen by the retired High Court Judge Sir William Macpherson. And it would be difficult to accuse this one of being a whitewash. Taking the best part of 18 months to complete, the Macpherson report was compiled after the team pored over 100,000 pages of supporting documentation, poked its nose into every nook and cranny of the police investigation, analysed the wider issues related to perceived racism within the police force, and heard testimony from 88 witnesses during the public inquiry stage. Excellent. Who is this? Jack Straw. Good for you. Not all of the witnesses were particularly forthcoming in their answers. You guessed it, the 5 suspects had been invited along. They clearly didn't want to be there, but they'd been threatened with prosecution if they didn't attend. Throughout the inquiry, all 5 suspects contributed very little other than to give evasive responses which ran along the lines of, "I don't remember," or "I have no idea." Wait, why did the 3 that have been acquitted of this show up? They can't be prosecuted. So you just be like, "Nah, f*** off, mate. I'm not coming. You can't do me for this." As they left the inquiry for the last time, they were pelted with bottles by an angry crowd, but it didn't seem to bother the suspects too much. Freaking awesome. In fact, it seems like they were up for a fight. I'm not sure how a person strongly suspected of murder is meant to leave the stage of a public inquiry, but this was quite unlike anything I'd ever seen. All 5 suspects adopted an unusually cocky swagger whilst almost sneering at the crowd and daring them to throw something else in their faces. If the police escorts hadn't been there to roughly manhandle them into their vehicles, it seems to me as if the suspects would have happily just leaped into the huge crowd of protesters with flailing fists. Despite the lack of cooperation from the suspects, the 350-page Macpherson report was finally published in February 1999, and it certainly pulled no punches. The report concluded that the police had failed in their investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence because of fundamental errors, incompetence, failure of leadership from senior officers, and here comes the real stinger: institutional racism. Shock of all shocks. It naturally came as a bit of a blow to the Metropolitan Police Service to be officially labelled as institutionally racist, so William Macpherson even helped them out by providing an explicit explanation of this term, which has since pretty much become accepted as the definition of institutional racism in the UK, and we quote here: "The collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture, or ethnic origin. It is seen in process, attitudes, and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantages minority ethnic people." That is a very succinct and well put together definition, as you'd expect after people went through 100,000 pages of documents over several years. It's important to bear in mind that the Macpherson report was never trying to imply that every individual member of the Metropolitan Police Force at this time was an ignorant racist. No, of course not. Most people, I don't know, it's hard to say, isn't it? But people generally aren't racist. And this was the 90s and it is the police. I don't know, I like to have a bit more faith in people than that. But I like to think like, oh yeah, no, most people aren't racist. It's just a few bad apples, but you never fucking know, do you? And it did put forward valid reasons as to how such a culture could easily emerge within an organisation like the police. When predominantly white officers only ever interact with ethnic minorities in relation to criminal behaviour, this has the unfortunate potential to create negative racial stereotypes that could pervade the whole organisation. And it was clear that sweeping changes were now required from top to bottom to tackle such negative stereotyping. But are there no black cops in 1990s? Like, really? The report found that earlier recommendations in the 1981 Scarman report commissioned after Brixton riots had been largely ignored. Macpherson came up with his own list of no less than 70 recommendations, which included detailed common-sense measures to confront the racist culture within the ranks and enable the total reform of police procedures, attitudes, and accountability. The recommendations also included wider points on public policy and law, including calls to strengthen awareness and accountability right across the civil service and various other public bodies. The good news here is that unlike the Scarman report, which was quickly forgotten in the space of about a week, the vast majority of Sir William Macpherson's recommendations were implemented to some degree within the next few years. Although the report was hailed by many as a milestone moment in the history of criminal justice in the UK, Doreen Lawrence wasn't entirely thrilled by the outcome. She stated afterwards, quote, "I was looking forward to the report, thinking that it would be a watershed for centuries to come, but instead it has only scratched the surface and has not gone to the heart of the problem. Nonetheless, the report represents an opportunity not to be missed by this society as a whole." Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be perfect, but it does seem like quite a good start, doesn't it? 70 points, 350 pages over several years. It's a start, and a start is better than nothing. Despite Doreen's cautious reservations, the Macpherson report was very much regarded as a watershed by many, and bearing in mind the damning nature of the comprehensive report and the wide-ranging set of positive proposals to tackle institutional racism across the board, I'm not sure if Sir William Macpherson would have realistically scratched any further. Although the actual case went largely cold over the next few years, it rarely slipped from public attention. In 1999, after protracted negotiations, the 5 suspects agreed to be interviewed separately on television by journalist Martin Bashir for the ITV network. Martin Bashir himself is no stranger to controversy, having conducted an interview with Princess Diana under false pretenses and a friendly interview with Michael Jackson, which some say threw the subject under a bus. Wait, I don't know these two things, but I guess they were pretty bad. The interviews proved to be difficult to watch, packed full of contradictions. All 5 of the suspects appeared to go out of their way to appear like nice, regular guys, and often ended every answer with Martin's first name, i.e., "No, I didn't do anything wrong, Martin," to show that they were personal people who didn't even mind being asked penetrating questions by a man of colour. And yet, some of the suspects were keen to cultivate their hard man image. For example, Neil Acorn revealed, "If someone put trouble my way, I would not stand for it. Simple as that." The interviews didn't really seem to please anybody. It was argued at the time that the suspects had already been given plenty of official opportunities to speak up on the murder, but had chosen to remain largely silent, so it was questioned why they were all being now given such a public platform to try and prove their innocence. It does all seem a bit weird, doesn't it? The suspects themselves later complained that the footage had been unfairly edited to make them all look guilty. 1999 was also the year in which Neville and Doreen Lawrence filed for divorce. Neville revealed that it had been sadly impossible to maintain their previous loving relationship after the murder of their son, as they could no longer reach out to each other in any meaningful way. Neville moved back to Jamaica and has since given hundreds of talks to schools, universities, and prisons, picking up several honorary doctorates in law and education along the way. Doreen stayed in the UK, where her continued efforts as a campaigner against racism eventually led to a seat in the House of Lords for the Right Honourable Barrister Doreen Lawrence OBE in 2013. Oh my god, that's amazing. God damn, good for you. In the year 2000, the Lawrence family were paid a paltry sum of £320,000 by the Metropolitan Police in damages for the failings of the institutionally racist organisation. Yeah, I feel like in the UK, it's like, yeah, it's a small amount, but it's like, yeah, it's kind of what the UK does. If this was America, it'd be like buying a mansion and like America always offers, like, always has like huge settlements compared to the UK. Friend Dwayne Brooks had to wait much longer as he endured a 6-year legal battle when he sued the police in 2000 for negligence and racism, claiming that their treatment of him as a suspect rather than a witness had led to him requiring psychiatric treatment. The claim for negligence was ultimately dismissed as the police were not deemed liable for his psychiatric illness, but he was allowed to pursue the claim for racism, eventually reaching a settlement with the police in 2006 after Dwayne accepted £100,000 and a written apology in return for dropping the case. The Police Complaints Authority was scrapped in 2004 and replaced with the Independent Police Complaints Commission, a new body with even greater independence from the police and the government, which was seen by many as a direct response to the Lawrence family's strong disapproval of how their original complaint was handled. Over the next few years, the freshly formed IPCC would certainly be kept busy in relation to the Stephen Lawrence investigation. In 2006, the BBC reported on the allegations from a whistleblower that DS John Davidson, a senior detective during the original investigation, had been accepting bribes to deliberately obstruct the case and protect the witnesses from none other than Clifford Norris. Wait, was that the drug baron dude? He's bribing a detective sergeant. That's nuts. Police, I always feel, I know it sounds super ignorant, but the cost of accepting a bribe, because police have such great pensions and they retire pretty young, if you accept a bribe and you get caught, that's all fucking done. How is it? It just doesn't seem like worth the risk, but I guess these were pretty massive bribes. You may remember that Clifford was the wealthy drug baron father of suspect David Norris and was also known as the godfather of Eltham. Yes. The whistleblower, a former corrupt police detective himself, told the BBC, quote, "Davidson told me that he was looking after Norris, and that to me meant that he was protecting him, protecting his family against arrest and any conviction." This is nuts. It was also alleged in a subsequent BBC report that Scotland Yard had been aware of this since the late 1990s, but had withheld the information from the Macpherson inquiry. God damn, if that is true, that is nuts. DS John Davidson always denied the allegations, and he was cleared of any wrongdoing by the IPCC, who concluded that it could find no link between DS John Davidson, Clifford Norris, and the murder investigation, and no evidence that the police had withheld any information from the inquiry. Okay, so, that is, as we've discussed, a brand new independent body who's saying that there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support this. So it's just one whistleblower against him. It does seem like, why would the whistleblower do this? But you don't know. There could be motivations. He could have just really not liked the guy. Scotland Yard subsequently attacked the BBC and accused the Broadcasting Corporation of lacking standards, ethics, and balance, as well as ignoring available evidence. Well, it doesn't seem that there was any evidence. It was just like one whistleblower's word. Just a few years later, the IPCC would again be looking into allegations of corruption relating to the investigation, following issues which were picked up by the Metropolitan Police themselves during a review of the case. An unnamed 62-year-old retired constable and an unnamed 53-year-old serving member of the police staff had been suspected of hiding and withholding evidence during the Macpherson inquiry. On this occasion, the anonymous pair were actually arrested, but they were released from bail when the IPCC concluded, without much in the way of detail, that no further action should be taken. But maybe even this new, super independent IPCC wasn't all it was cracked up to be. It was only after the organisation regenerated yet again into the Independent Office for Police Conduct in 2018 that a further investigation was conducted into the matter of DS John Davidson, which concluded that the police should have passed all information available about these allegations of corruption onto the Macpherson inquiry and failed to do so. This new body also passed on evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service relating to the possible criminal misconduct of 4 other officers working on the case, including the 2 familiar names, Detective Superintendent Brian Whedon, who chose not to arrest anybody for 2 weeks, and Detective Inspector Ben Bullock, who had already been cleared of 11 of the 13 charges before retiring the very next day. In 2023, the CPS announced that it would not be pursuing criminal charges against any of these officers. Baroness Lawrence responded to this recent decision with the words, "Not a single police officer has been disciplined or will be charged. In my opinion, the police have, yet again, got away scot-free." The Crown Prosecution Service admitted that it understood why the Lawrence family may have felt disappointed by the decision. Yeah, it's probably not quite cutting it to say they're disappointed. Perhaps we'll only make real progress on this when the Independent Office for Police Conduct inevitably undergoes yet another revamp and rebrand in the distant future. Yeah, it does seem a little bit like history repeating itself, doesn't it, guys? Come on, do better. I'm putting a $5 on the Independent Police Complaints Bureau of independent people who are independent of the police. Yeah, it's just rebranding nonsense. So, if we rewind to 2006, we begin to see the first real developments in the collection of compelling evidence since, we begin to see the real developments in collection of compelling evidence. This was the year that the Daily Mail decided to repeat its controversial murderers headline in frustration at the lack of progress. And once again, can't believe I'm saying this, but good for fucking you, Daily Mail. And repeated its invitation to the suspects to sue the newspaper if it was wrong, an invitation which again was not taken up. What the Daily Mail may not have known at the time is that a new cold case review was already underway, which was being conducted in top secret. Professor Angela Gallup had been called up again to assist in the case, and this time her team of experts were in a position to re-examine every single scrap of evidence using mitochondrial DNA techniques which had not been around back when they'd had the last opportunity to take a look. And they came across a couple of tiny things that were to change everything. The team were now able to identify a microscopic speck of blood which had been dried into the fibers of a jacket belonging to suspect Gary Dobson and matched the DNA profile of Stephen Lawrence by a certainty of 999 in 1,000. Gary Dobson, you better start praying that you were one of the original 3. Otherwise, you seem to be fairly fucked, son. It would have been impossible for the blood to have been transferred from elsewhere as a dried sample and could only have been entrapped in the fibers when still wet. A pair of jeans taken from the bedroom of suspect David Norris were also found to contain 2 tiny dark brown strands of hair measuring between 1 and 2 millimeters in length. 2 tiny dark brown strands of hair which were conclusively identified as belonging to Stephen Lawrence. You're also f***ed, dude. Like, what the? This is... So you got rid of the clothes? Did you just get rid of the ones that were just a little bit bloody and you didn't get rid of everything? You have to get rid of everything. The shoes, the clothes, cut your hair, shave your beard. What are you up to? For the first time, it appeared that real evidence was finally coming to light around 13 years after the murder, even if it was only potentially incriminating to just 2 of the 5 suspects, Dobson and Norris. There was another problem, though. It would have been perfectly legal to charge Gary Dobson in light of this new evidence, as he'd never previously been put on trial for the murder. Yeah, okay, so who was it? Dobson and Norris. So David Norris is off the hook. However, the same couldn't be said for David Norris. He was one of the 3 defendants in the private prosecution of 1996 who were acquitted of murder and therefore couldn't be tried again for the same crime under the double jeopardy law. Bugger. That's crazy. It's new DNA evidence. Like, what? Oh, hang on just a minute, though. Oh, please, Danny, please tell me that something happens and they managed to make this work. One of the many recommendations put forward in the Macpherson report was a change in the law which would allow an acquitted murder suspect to face a retrial in exceptional circumstances when fresh and viable evidence had been uncovered. Excellent. This was a direct response to the disastrous initial investigation and was based on the idea that if the police completely cocked up a case the first time around, the victims should be allowed to seek justice again later down the line when the police got their act together and started finding evidence. Yes, as it should be. Not everyone agreed with this recommendation, as some feared that this could lead to repeated prosecutions of entirely innocent parties. Yeah, but there needs to be, what was it? Fresh and viable new evidence. And if there's not fresh and viable new evidence, then that's quickly going to stop happening. This seems like a very reasonable law. Nevertheless, the 800-year-old double jeopardy law was finally updated in the Criminal Justice Act of 2003 to allow retrials in England and Wales if both the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Court of Appeal agreed that an original acquittal should be quashed. And that's exactly what happened in 2010 when the Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer QC. Keir Starmer is in Keir Starmer, now leader of the Labour Party. Well, there you go. Successfully applied to the Court of Appeal to quash Gary Dobson's murder acquittal from 1996. Sir Keir Starmer is now more widely recognised as the leader of the Labour Party, and depending on how long it takes for this video to come out, there's every chance that he might even be Prime Minister by now, after the UK has endured another 13 years of Conservative rule. Yeah, Conservatives have been in charge for a long time. He might even have reopened the mines and given the milk back to the school children. One can but dream. Both Gary Dobson and David Norris were charged with the murder of Stephen Lawrence in late 2010, although this major event didn't attract headlines at the time, as reporting restrictions had been put in place to help protect the ongoing investigation and ensure that the suspects were given a fair hearing. Yeah, the ability for the press to be silenced on stuff in the UK is pretty extraordinary. Like, this was just not in the papers because the government said no. Pretty wild, right? For like a big, country that you think's quite free. It's not, really. Press freedom in the UK is kind of bad. It hadn't been too hard to track down Gary Dobson in 2010 because he was already in prison. Over the years, he'd been arrested for a string of offences and was once suspected of helping to smuggle illegal immigrants into the UK, although the charges against him were later dropped. He had, however, only just started his first prison sentence in 2010 after he was ensnared by the serious organised crime agency who filmed him dropping off a bit of weed. Well, actually quite a lot of weed. He was carrying about £330,000 worth of the stuff, which earned him a 5-year prison sentence. I'm like, oh no, he went to prison for weed? And then it's like, oh no, he's a massive drug dealer. Okay, fair enough. The other defendant, David Norris, wasn't in prison in 2010, but the son of the godfather of Eltham had already served an 18-month stretch from 2002 after, wait for it, shouting racial abuse and hurling a drink at a black police officer from a car which was being driven by another original suspect, Neil Acorte, who actually drove right at the police officer. David Norris may have been living in a posh gated community at the time of Stephen Lawrence's murder, but after falling out with his gangster daddy, he was living in more modest surroundings when he was charged with murder in 2010. In fact, he was living in a bedsit above a small pub in Greenwich and was trying to make ends meet by selling scrap metal. Oh, that's grim. From the gated community to that. This was a far cry from the life he was living at his dad's luxury mock-up Tudor mansion funded by crime, but it was probably still preferable to the lifestyle that awaited him if he was found guilty of murder. The trial got underway on the 14th of November 2011 at the Central Criminal Court, presided over by Mr. Justice Treacy. It had been tricky to select a jury of 12, as Mr. Justice Treacy had insisted that the jury should not include anyone with connections to the police or forensic science or the local area, or indeed anyone who already had a detailed knowledge of the case, as the judge felt that everything that had been reported in the past should now be completely disregarded to enable the case to start with a clean slate. Considering how frequently the case had been extensively reported in the press, I can only assume that the final jury was made up of people who had been living in a swamp for the previous 18 years. It could also be made up of people like me who are vaguely aware of the case but didn't really know much about it because it was when we were growing up and just kids. The case for the prosecution was led by Mark Ellison QC, who was keen to place the emphasis on the new forensic evidence which included the speck of Stephen Lawrence's blood found on Gary Dobson's jacket and the strands of Stephen's hair found on the jeans found in Dean Norris's bedroom. Of course, none of this new forensic evidence revealed which of the suspects was wielding the knife that ultimately killed Stephen Lawrence, but Mark Ellison's argument was that Stephen's death was the result of a joint enterprise carried out by a gang of violent thugs. That's it, the joint enterprise thing. Is where you also get guilty of murder because someone in the group murdered someone and you reasonably foresaw that they could murder or cause GBH to someone, grievous bodily harm, all of whom were equally culpable for the murder. The main thrust of the defense was that this new forensic evidence had been in police storage for 18 years and could potentially have become contaminated over time. Yeah, 999 out of 1,000, mate. Not such a good argument. The point appeared to be given some credence during a cross-examination of the Metropolitan Police's chief forensic scientist, Adrian Wayne. When Gary Dobson's barrister, Tim Roberts QC, asked the scientist if it was possible for contamination to have occurred during the point of storage, Adrian Wayne admitted that he couldn't rule it out. Tim Roberts QC also pointed out that Gary Dobson had not worn the blood-stained jacket for years, and that the witnesses had testified that his client had been at home with his parents on the night of the attack. The barrister told the jury, "The papers in this case are voluminous, but the actual physical evidence upon which this charge is brought, the fibers and fragments, would not fill a teaspoon." It's a pretty good argument for old Tim Roberts QC there, isn't it? I mean, I know I criticized it before, but it's like, that's what it was brought on. And he's just trying to say that, yeah, no, I don't know. I think why I think that is because I know that juries are quite hard to persuade with forensic evidence because they expect it to be super airtight. And this guy's just poking a tiny hole in it, and that can be enough. Similarly, David Norris's barrister, Stephen Batten QC, also argued that the evidence had been contaminated, whilst pointing out that his client was far too stylish to be seen out and about in the varnish-stained jeans that contained strands of Stephen Lawrence's hair. He asked the jury, what is the probability, or even possibility, that a self-respecting young man would be out for the evening with his mates in those filthy things? That is weak, my dude. Although the case appeared to hinge on this new forensic evidence, there was of course much more to uncover and dissect over the course of the next few weeks of the trial. Dwayne Brooks was called to give evidence during what was a very difficult time for him, as his father had just died the night before he took the stand. Dwayne was now a councillor for the Liberal Democrats in Lewisham and had put his name forward as the Liberal candidate for the London 2012 mayoral election, although he wouldn't make the shortlist. He would later make an unusual defection to the Conservative Party in 2018. All the people involved in this got very into politics later. Dwayne became very emotional during questioning, breaking down in tears on multiple occasions, perhaps not too surprising, given that just one day after his father had died, he was being asked to recall the night that his best friend was murdered. He was challenged by defense barrister Stephen Batten QC over how some of his statements appeared to have changed slightly over the years, and how some of his memories didn't fit at all with the memories of the other witnesses at the bus stop. For example, Dwayne recalled that he himself was chased at one point by a member of the group, an event which none of the other witnesses could remember seeing at all. However, by the end of the cross-examination, it was Dwayne Brooks who appeared to display the most composure, while Stephen Batten QC had got himself worked up into a bit of a lather. As Dwayne stepped down from the witness box, he glared long and hard at the two suspects, who immediately looked away at something that must have caught their gaze in the complete opposite direction. The jury were later shown segments from the Footscray footage, the surveillance footage from Gary Dobson's flat, which captured a typical wholesome night in with defendants Gary Dobson and David Norris, and other original suspects Neil Aycourt and Luke Knight. Wholesome night in, where they're playing with knives and talking about being racists. The younger brother, Jamie Aycourt, wasn't caught on camera, but this was only because he was in custody at the time in relation to an entirely different offence. Dobson's defense barrister, Tim Roberts, had argued beforehand that the Footscray footage should not be shown in court as it had no value as evidence other than to show that the teenagers had been unpleasant people. That's putting it a little mildly, as the court was able to see for themselves when Mr. Justice Treasty ruled that the footage should be shown. Members of the group, who are seen playing with big knives and swinging them about as if they're practicing the most effective stabbing motion, not a crime in itself of course, it's just that most people would probably make do with an imaginary lightsaber when playing that sort of game. The most shocking segments of the footage are the ones in which the gang are enjoying conversations which are impossible to reproduce here, as they're packed with the most appalling racist slurs you can imagine. We already mentioned Gary Dobson appears to recall the incident in which Gerdie Bangy was stabbed in a Wimpy bar. He also recalls a fun incident at work in which a black colleague playfully stole his hat, to which Dobson apparently responded by unsheathing his Stanley knife and threatening to slice him up. Psycho. David Norris then goes on a sickening rant, again using words that we won't repeat here, about how if he ever decides to commit suicide, he would first like to torture and kill every black person he ever came across by skinning them alive and setting them on fire. What the fuck? The Footscray footage doesn't exactly paint, and it's also pretty dim, because if you skin someone alive, all of their pain receptors are going to be gone, so when you set them on fire, they're not going to feel anything. Use your brain, David, you thicko. The Footscray footage doesn't exactly paint any suspects in a positive light, but again, it has to be emphasized that it doesn't conclusively link them to any specific crime either. It shows that the gang are utterly vile people, but not necessarily utterly vile criminals. When defendant Gary Dobson finally took to the stand, he wasn't quite the same swaggering figure that had strolled out of the public inquiry in 1999 looking for a fight with the crowd. The slightly more subdued version of Dobson was naturally asked about his own thoughts on the Footscray footage, which had sent ripples of disgust through the entire courtroom. Dobson described some of the footage as just a bit of friendly banter and pointed out that he was accustomed to using the N-word frequently because he enjoyed listening to hip-hop. Oh please, you're just a racist. His bloodstained jacket suggested that Dobson was more of a prog rock fan than a hip-hop fan. It was emblazoned with the name of the 70s band Supertramp, which admittedly would have been an unusual and perhaps deeply uncool jacket for a teenager to be sporting in the early 90s. I actually quite liked them, but I still wouldn't have left the house wearing a Supertramp jacket in my teens. Dobson claimed that he was never really a fan of the band anyway, and the jacket had been a crap birthday present from his family when he was a young kid. He said that he had only worn it to school a few times before he put it away for good after the other kids took the piss out of him. He reckoned he hadn't worn it in years. Now, that's all well and good, but prosecution barrister Mark Ellison pointed out to Dobson that the jacket showed clear signs of heavy wear and was covered in cigarette burns. Dobson responded by saying that other family members had borrowed his jacket from time to time, including his brother, his mum, and his auntie. Ah yes, the classic highly in-demand Supertramp jacket. He seemed to be implying that one of them must have been guilty of the murder, but it certainly wasn't him. Perhaps it was the auntie who bought the crap jacket in the first place, so this was payback. Gary Dobson also claimed that he was indoors at the time of the murder on the night of 1993, but there were inconsistencies in the story he originally gave to the police a couple of weeks after the murder and the story that he was now telling in court. He originally claimed that he'd been at the family home all night listening to music and had never left the house. He only heard about the murder of Stephen Lawrence after he read about it in the newspaper. However, this conflicted with the testimony of another witness, a friend of Gary Dobson by the name of Matthew White, who told the police that he'd been hanging around with Dobson at the home of the Acorn brothers late that night. So, Gary Dobson was now saying in court that he was at home for most of the night during the time in which Stephen Lawrence was attacked, but then he popped round to Neil and Jamie Acord's home very late at night to borrow a CD. And not just any old CD, though. He wanted to borrow a Bob Marley CD because Gary Dobson was obviously just the type of person to dig the groove of Bob Marley. I bet he liked Stevie Wonder and Aretha Franklin too. He was now stating that the first time he heard of the murder was when his friend Matthew White burst through the door to tell everyone that a young lad had just been killed around the corner. By the way, remember that name, Matthew White? It might become important 12 years later. Might it, Danny? Might it? Bit of foreshadowing there, is that, Danny?
That's a surprise tool that can help us later.
When questioned by Mark Ellison QC, Dobson couldn't give a rational explanation as to why his story had changed so significantly, but he did point out that the police officers had only asked him where he was at the time of the murder, rather than where he was a bit later on that same night. His parents backed him up in court. Shocking. But again, there was a very slight difference in what his mother Pauline had originally told the police and what she was now saying in court. In her original police statement, Pauline claimed that she had last seen her son on that night making toast in the kitchen at around 10:40 to 10:45 p.m. When his parents, and I know you're like under oath and shit, but can we really? They're very biased. She now claimed that that time had actually been 10:30. When questioned by Mark Ellison over why the time had changed slightly, a visibly irritated Pauline Dobson snapped back, give or take 10 minutes then. But it's interesting that Pauline had pushed back the clock by around 10 to 15 minutes to a time that was much closer to the exact moment of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. The other defendant, David Norris, was keen to point out that he was no angel, but that did not make him a murderer. He admitted that the racist conversation captured on the Footscray footage was immature and put his violent attitude down to his upbringing. As he put it to Mark Ellison, "I grew up in London, sir. You learn to look after yourself." In a similar fashion to Gary Dobson, he was now keen to shift responsibility for the relevant clothing exhibit, in his case the jeans containing strands of Stephen Lawrence's hair, onto his immediate family. He pointed out that the jeans were far too baggy for him, as he preferred tight-fitting clothes, so they must have belonged to his brother, who was never once implicated in anything in this case. Yeah, I mean, you see what they're doing here, right? It's just like reasonable doubt. They don't have to prove that the brother wore the jeans. They just have to sow enough doubt that the Norris chap didn't. Maybe Norris didn't have an auntie to throw under the bus. The exact whereabouts of David Norris on that night were more than a little murky. He freely admitted that he regularly visited the home of the Acorn brothers late in the evenings during that period, but not on that night. Definitely not on that night. When Mark Ellison asked him twice how he could be so sure about that, Norris responded both times that it was because he was an innocent man. His mother, Teresa, later told the court that her son would definitely have been at home at that time of the night with the rest of the family, as it was a school night. She seemed to be suggesting that as a matter of course, her 16-year-old son was home by a sensible time every single school night. Not only does this conflict with her son's own admission that he regularly visited the Acorns late in the evening, it's also a little odd because Norris had left school by this point. Maybe just hadn't told his mum. So it's not like he had to get his PE kit ready for the next morning. When challenged about these points by Mark Ellison, Teresa could only respond with, "My son would have been at home." One of the most interesting tussles toward the end of the trial occurred when the prosecution intended to call up a scientist by the name of Rosalind Hammond to the stand. Rosalind was a scientist working at Professor Angela Gallup's company, LGC Forensics, which had uncovered the new evidence on the clothing of the suspects, and the prosecution's intention was to get her take on just how likely it was that any of this evidence could have been contaminated while in police storage. Excellent. Wait, who's this for? For the prosecution. The defense barristers really didn't like this idea at all. You know why? Because she's going to be like, it's vanishingly slim. There's basically no chance. There's no reasonable chance. Tim Roberts QC argued that Rosalind wasn't an expert in contamination and wasn't an independent professional, as she was working for the team that kept coming up with all this so-called evidence. He pleaded with Mr. Justice Treacy to exclude Rosalind Hammond from proceedings on the foggy grounds that her opinions could trespass on the function of the jury. I mean, you might as well take a crack at it, Tim, but I don't think this is going to work out very well. It's almost as if they were fearful of what she might have to say. Treacy considered this request, but later ruled that Rosalind should be heard. Excellent choice. And it turns out she had quite a lot to say, as she was banging on for hours. She essentially guided the court through every single step that would have needed to occur to create any risk of contamination on any of the clothing exhibits, concluding that each and every step was unlikely and that there was no realistic possibility of contamination. It was also again emphasized that the only possible way for the blood found on the Supertramp jacket to have become entrapped in the fibers was if it had been fresh, wet blood. It's difficult to think of a realistic way in which this jacket could have later become contaminated with the fresh blood of Stephen Lawrence or a close family member whilst it was being held in storage for 18 years. Good job, Rosalind. You just going in there and being like, there's no chance, which is exactly what you should be doing. Perhaps the defense barristers had a couple of theories about this. No, apparently they didn't. They didn't have much more than the aforementioned admission from the Metropolitan Police Chief's forensic scientist that the contamination couldn't be ruled out. Aside from that, the defense were unable to provide an expert to demonstrate how exactly contamination could have occurred. Sounds like you really should have found someone who can be like, because you can come up with ways, like however unlikely, and just make them seem slightly more likely. Likely enough that it's beyond, that they could be like, oh, we can't get it beyond all reasonable doubt. You couldn't find anyone? Shortly before Christmas 2011, the closing speeches from both sides were heard, after which Mr. Justice Treacy gave a lengthy closing address to the jury in which he ran through all of the evidence one last time, but would have to wait until after Christmas for the verdict. On January the 3rd, 2012, the jury returned to the courtroom, having spent just over 8 hours in deliberations. The unanimous verdict was declared that Gary Dobson and David Norris were guilty of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. Neville and Doreen Lawrence may have been long divorced, but they presented a united front in the courtroom as always. Both silently shed tears shortly after the verdict was announced. As the two convicted murderers were removed from the courtroom and escorted to their cells, David Norris remained silent, while Gary Dobson yelled in the direction of the jury, oh, this is going to get spicy, "You've condemned an innocent man today. I hope you can all live with that." Oh, come off it, David. You're guilty as fucking sin, mate. And the court agrees, so we can say that. No need for an allegedly. I was a little surprised that he felt the jury had only condemned one innocent man rather than two. You clown. I didn't even pick up on that. Perhaps he knew he was guilty, but he felt compelled to speak up for his friend. Sentencing took place 2 days later. Oh, come on, put them away for life. Let's do a whole life order. During which Mr. Justice Treacy noted that the defendants were involved in a crime which was committed for no other reason than racial hatred. He told the defendants a totally innocent 18-year-old youth on the threshold of a promising life was brutally cut down in the street in front of eyewitnesses by a racist, thuggish gang. You were both members of that gang. I have no doubt at all that you fully subscribed to its views and attitudes. Whilst the judge conceded that it was not known who wielded the knife, he ruled that the person who owned the knife did so with the knowledge and approval of the rest of the gang, and while such a random attack on a stranger was clearly not premeditated, the judge suggested that the group were fully prepared to attack a victim in this way should an opportunity arise. Yes, all you have to show is that they knew and approved, apparently, of someone having a knife and that it could be used to cause GBH, which when you're in a gang and you're carrying a knife, that's what the point of the knife is. Easy. He also noted that neither Dobson nor Norris expressed the slightest remorse or regret for their part in their murder. Although, to be fair, they are claiming innocence. So it'd be weird if they were like, yeah, if I did it, I feel bad. But I didn't do it. The sentencing may have seemed surprisingly light for a murder conviction. Gary Dobson, who of course was already serving a 5-year sentence for drug smuggling, was sentenced to a minimum prison term of 15 years and 2 months, while David Norris was given 14 years and 3 months. It's not enough. I know, this is normally where I'm like, God, I wish it was America. America, they'd just be like life without parole, biatch. And here it's like 14 years. When was this? 2012? So we're at 12 years. So these guys are going to be getting out of prison in the next few years, which that's not brilliant because these guys belong in prison forever. Mr. Justice Treacy acknowledged that the sentences were lower than some might have expected. If the pair had been found guilty of murder committed just a couple of years later, they could have expected to receive life sentences with a minimum term of 30 years each. That seems way more on point. But the point is that Gary Dobson was only 17 years old in 1993, while David Norris was only 16. That is important to take into account. And so they both received juvenile sentences to reflect their ages and maturity at the time of the murder. Okay, I gotta say, that is a huge mitigating factor because your brain just doesn't work properly at those ages. And don't get me wrong, I definitely think that these guys would grow up to be scumbags, but that is really young. There are some who have questioned whether this was entirely fair. As Dobson and Norris were standing there 18 years after the event and protesting their innocence as adults, it was felt by many that they should be sentenced as adults. No, but that's not when they committed the crime. They committed the crime as juveniles, and that's when it matters. If they were 8 and they'd done this, and then they were facing trial, which they wouldn't because it's below the age of criminal responsibility, but bear with me. If they were facing trial 20 years later, they're not thinking of them as 28-year-olds, they're thinking of them as 8-year-olds. And I know 8 isn't the same as 16, but 16 isn't the same as 18 or 20 or 25 or 30. Like, brains are still growing. A request was later made to the Attorney General Dominic Grieve to assess if the sentencing had been unduly lenient, but the Attorney General decided that the matter should not be referred to the Court of Appeal as the minimum terms were within the appropriate range of sentences. Gary Dobson's mother Pauline protested to the press that her son was innocent and claimed that every police officer who had ever worked on the case was aware that Dobson had done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, in the immediate aftermath of the verdict, the Lawrence family expressed mixed emotions outside the courtroom. Doreen Lawrence seemed to be pleased with the actual verdicts, but also made it clear that this was no celebration. She asked, "How can I celebrate when my son lies buried, when I cannot see him or speak to him? These verdicts will not bring my son back. Had the police done their job properly, I would have spent the last 18 years grieving for my son rather than fighting to get his killers to court." Neville Lawrence stated that he was full of joy and relief at the verdicts, but also noted that the other members of the gang who murdered his son were still walking free and called for them to be brought to justice. Scotland Yard Commissioner Bernard Hogan Howe appeared to be directly responding to this statement when he declared the other people involved in the murder of Stephen Lawrence should not rest easy in their beds. This doesn't appear that he's directly responding to the statement. He's definitely saying that. As we'll soon discover, there continued to be fresh discoveries and developments even 30 years after the murder. But to date, none of the other people involved in the murder have ever faced new charges. So the statement from Scotland Yard is ringing a little hollow at the moment. Yeah, but we've still got a whole bunch of pages left, Annie. There's got to be more to this story, right? We're only like 3/4 of the way through. As for the other 3 suspects, Luke Knight is the only one who appears to have kept out of trouble. He still lives in the local area and was last seen working as a roofer and a labourer, although he recently applied to be rehoused in a different area. He claims that he was suffering from psychological issues after enduring regular intimidation from anti-racist groups. We've already mentioned that Neil Aycourt, the alleged leader of the gang, got into trouble with Gary Dobson in 2002 when they both shouted racial abuse at a police officer of colour before Aycourt drove a car right at him, an offence which landed Aycourt in prison for the first time. In later years, he took his mother's maiden name of Stewart and in an attempt to escape any association with the murder and potential revenge attacks. And it was under this new name of Neil Stewart that he was sentenced to 6 years in prison in 2017 for his part in a massive cannabis smuggling operation worth over £3 million. He was released after serving less than half his sentence. Again, like drugs, I'm like, yeah, 6 years seems fine. 3 years for, cannabis smuggling. Kind of yeah, okay, cool. But he should be in prison for other shit. Younger brother Jamie Acorn was also involved in that cannabis smuggling operation. In fact, he was the ringleader, and it seems that the younger brother had usurped Neil Acorn's position as top dog in later life. Just 1 year after the murder of Stephen Lawrence, Jamie Acorn had been involved in a fight in which he was accused of stabbing white teenager Darren Giles through the heart, causing the victim to suffer cardiac arrest, although he survived the ordeal. Good Lord, Darren. You got a heart of steel. He got stabbed in the heart, had a heart attack from getting stabbed in the heart, and survived. Good Lord. Jamie Acorn was cleared of any charges, as it was ruled that he acted in self-defense. He apparently led a pleasant middle-class lifestyle for many years after this, settling down with his girlfriend and child in a plush pad a few miles away from the murder scene, although it's not exactly clear how he earned his living. I don't know if that's because it's just not public record or Danny's implying, where did that money come from? You did crimes? What we do know is that when his role as ringleader of the he was the cannabis smuggling thing. Oh, okay. When his role as ringleader of the £3 million cannabis smuggling operation was exposed, he was sentenced to prison for 9 years in 2018, but he has very recently been freed in 2023 after serving less than half. So, as nobody has faced charges for the murder since 2012, we must surely be nearing the end of this story, right? I know I'm beginning to get a bit cramp in my hands, and Simon hasn't taken a swig of Coke in over an hour, so we can't be far too off now. On coffee today, Danny, actually. But the thing about the Stephen Lawrence story is that it's never really fallen off the radar over the last 12 years. The murder investigation has officially been closed and reopens more times than a disreputable Rotherham kebab house with hygiene issues, and there's always some new dramatic revelation or inquiry or report dominating the headlines for a little while and keeping the case firmly in the public consciousness. One notable development kicked off in 2013, following an investigation conducted by Channel 4 and The Guardian newspaper, which uncovered more dubious behaviour from the police, sparking another official inquiry. We have been labouring under the impression that the police weren't really doing anything of note during the first few years of the investigation, but that's not entirely fair. They were keeping themselves very busy indeed. It's just that they were focusing on completely the wrong things. In the wake of these new reports from Channel 4 and The Guardian, which featured alarming allegations from former police officer turned whistleblower Peter Francis, Home Secretary Theresa May commissioned a review from the Lawrence family lawyer Mark Ellison to investigate potential police corruption and improper surveillance activity relating to the case. The subsequent Ellison report, published in 2014, made for uncomfortable reading. It was concluded that whistleblower Peter Francis had been working undercover within an anti-racist campaign group in the 1990s, joining the fight against racial injustice, when in fact his infiltration of the group was just a devious attempt to dig up dirt on the Lawrence family, Dwayne Brooks, and indeed everyone involved in the campaign. Why? They're the victims! In his role as an undercover officer working for the Special Demonstration Squad, Francis had already revealed to Channel 4 and The Guardian that he had been under pressure from his superiors to try and discredit the Lawrence family and undermine the campaign group in a bid to halt any credible calls for further scrutiny of the botched murder investigation. Bruh, you're trying to cover this up, in a terribly egregious way. Good God, that's wild. I mean, I don't know why I'm surprised anymore, because it's the police corruption in this seems absolutely monstrous. While the attempt to dig up the dirt on the Lawrence family was a waste of time, as there was no dirt to dig up, Francis was also involved in an operation which did manage to get Dwayne Brooks arrested and charged with criminal damage after it was alleged that he had been caught on camera behaving in a violent and disorderly manner during an anti-racist protest march. The mud didn't stick on this one, though. The case was thrown out of court after the judge declared it to be an abuse of the legal process. Excellent. It sounds as if this had been a failed attempt to discredit Dwayne's efforts to sue the police for negligence and racism over the treatment of him in the immediate aftermath of the murder, in which case it may have seriously backfired. None of this information was given to the Macpherson inquiry back in the late 1990s, and indeed the Independent Police Complaints Commission, or whatever it was bloody called at that point, were now forced to admit that they were wrong in their much earlier conclusions that the Metropolitan Police had most definitely not withheld important information from the Macpherson report. One of the police officers that had been involved in preparing the responses to the Macpherson inquiry was Acting Detective Inspector Richard Walton, who was on an accelerated promotion scheme at the time, a scheme which seemed to work out pretty well for Walton, as by the time this new Ellison report was published in 2014, Walton had risen through the ranks to become the head of counter-terrorism command. However, it had now been discovered that back when Walton was preparing responses for the Macpherson inquiry, he had a meeting with one of the undercover officers working on the smear campaign intended to discredit the Lawrence family and others. This was seen by many as an attempt by Walton to gather information which could undermine the inquiry, and it's interesting that he was clearly aware of the dubious undercover mission, but carelessly forgot to mention it in any of the responses to the Macpherson inquiry. Yeah, because it doesn't look good for him. That's why he didn't remember, apparently, allegedly. The Independent Police Complaints Commission now felt that Walton had a misconduct case to answer, but just 6 days after it became clear that the serving head of Counter-Terrorism Command would be facing disciplinary proceedings, he was somewhat conveniently allowed to retire and avoid further scrutiny. That's another one of those, I expect your resignation letter on my desk in the morning sort of situations, isn't it? This was obviously a move which didn't go down well with the Lawrence family, who had unsuccessfully urged the police to postpone Walton's plans to retire and claim his juicy pension. Although the murder investigation was officially declared inactive in 2020 after it was deemed that there were no fresh lines of inquiry to explore, very recent developments have proven yet again that the case shows no sign of fading away anytime soon. Ooh. Yeah, there's loads of pages left. What is this? You may be remembering that the eyewitness reported seeing a gang of 6 thugs. Oh, the last man, the fair-haired man. 6 thugs attacked Stephen Lawrence on the night of April the 22nd, 1993, and yet only 5 suspects were ever identified. So who was this elusive 6th attacker? Well, I think we'll be waiting a pretty long time for the police to come up with any decent answers for that one. So it's a good job we've got the BBC to sort this kind of thing out. Yeah, where the police fail, journalists thrive. I like this. In June 2023, the British Board, this is so recent. It was so long ago. Oh my, it's 30 years later. In June 2023, the British Broadcasting Corporation reported on the results of their own exhaustive re-examination of the case, which led directly to the police officially naming the 6th suspect for the first time 30 years after the murder. The identity of a man, often referred to as the fair-haired attacker, is now suspected to be Matthew White. And if you've got a really good memory, you'll recognize that name from earlier in the video. Wait, this was the dude who you told us to remember about him coming back in like 12 years, right, Danny? He was the friend of convicted murderer Gary Dobson, who was hanging around the home of the Acorn brothers on the night of the murder and gave conflicting evidence to the police, which suggested that Dobson hadn't been tucked away safely at home all night. According to the suspiciously revised testimony of Gary Dobson during the trial, Matthew White had been the one who'd burst through the door and announced that a young guy had just been killed. But it now transpires that fair-haired Matthew White may have been one of the 6 gang members, which definitely included Gary Dobson and David Norris, who had been responsible for the murder. The police had been talking to White right from the start, although for many years he was only identified in documentation as Witness K before his name was finally revealed during the trial of Dobson and Norris. He was actually arrested twice, in 2000 and 2013, on suspicion of involvement in the murder, but on both occasions the CPS had deemed there was no realistic prospect of conviction. The BBC discovered that White's own stepfather had approached the police in 1993 to report that he had good reason to believe that his stepson had been involved in the murder. Oh my, spicy. Quite staggeringly, this information wasn't recorded properly, and the line of inquiry was never pushed. I'm just not surprised by anything that the police do badly anymore. In what the police describe now as a significant and regrettable error. You bet they do. Another witness told the police in 2000 that Matthew White had openly admitted being part of the attack and that his alibi for his whereabouts on that night was false, but the police chose to ignore this and accept White's version of accounts. I don't even know what to say anymore. It's nonsense. This is just unbelievable. The Macpherson inquiry had asked for details on progress into the investigation of Matthew White, but the police had failed to give a response. The BBC also tracked down an ex-prisoner who had spent time in prison with White in 2015. This was whilst White was serving a 4-month sentence for an incident which involved him stealing meat from a branch of Lidl, threatening and abusing a black security guard, and having a syringe in a public place which may have had something to do with his heroin addiction. The ex-prisoner, who asked to remain anonymous, told the BBC that White had admitted to him that he was part of the attack on Stephen Lawrence, and whilst White distanced himself from the actual stabbing, he was happy to talk about his role in the initial fracas and his belief that the police just couldn't be bothered to investigate him properly. Oh, and that incident at the branch of Lidl for which he was jailed may have been a little more serious than stealing a bit of meat and shouting abuse. Yes, people don't go to jail for stealing meat and shouting abuse. In November 2023, it was again left to the BBC, rather than the police, to track down Bethel Ikpeza, a security guard who had been threatened by White while apprehending him for trying to leg it from the supermarket with a bag of stolen meat. Ikpeze, who was born in Nigeria, claims that White wasn't just holding a syringe in a public place, he was threatening to stab Bethel with a blood-drenched needle while screaming racial slurs in his face. Yeah, it's a bit more serious, isn't it? You're threatening someone with a potentially, I guess it could be considered a deadly weapon. And just to hammer the point home, White angrily revealed that he had killed before with no consequences. Well, holy shit. White was apparently on the brink of stabbing Bethel in the neck when the security guard managed to get a hold of him and wrestle him to the ground, where he kept him restrained until the police arrived. Bethel told the BBC that he was shocked when he heard that his attacker hadn't been charged with trying to stab him with a bloody syringe or hurling racist abuse. White had initially denied even having a syringe on him that day, until CCTV footage showed him holding it close to Bethel in a threatening manner, at which point he changed his story. He was this, "It's not me, Gov!" He was only sentenced to 4 months in prison after being found guilty of having a syringe in a public place, along with the meat stealing and the threatening behaviour, but the charge for the latter notably didn't include any racial abuse. So, what can we do with this new information that's been provided by the BBC? Well, unfortunately, it came a little too late. Matthew White died from a drug overdose in 2020, aged 50. No comment from me there. No comment. But the revelation does further implicate two of the other original suspects, Neil and Jamie Acorte, as White had indicated to the police that he was at their home on the night of the attack. Furthermore, the anonymous ex-prisoner also claims that White told him in 2015 that it was older brother Neil Acorte who started getting silly with a knife. The BBC, that's a quote, by the way. I wouldn't state it that way myself. The BBC tracked down both the Acorte brothers separately and ambushed them on camera to ask if they had anything to say over these new allegations. The only thing Neil Acorte had to say on film was "fuck off," while Jamie just hurried away in silence. Honestly, that's the right thing to do. Don't say anything, your lawyer would be upset. They should have asked Martin Bashir to ask the questions. They seemed a bit chattier when he was around. If that sounds like a pretty recent development for a 30-year-old case, we can actually do better than that. In fact, the latest development is quite annoyingly recent, as I had very nearly finished writing the script when the latest headline broke in November 2023. And again, it's all thanks to the BBC, whose ongoing investigation has revealed that one of the senior officers involved in the original investigation, the hitherto unmentioned Ray Adams, was a bent copper. I felt like this headline was a little overdramatic, in a way, as there's no indication at this stage that Ray Adams, now 81 and denying any allegation of corruption, influenced or hampered the investigation in any way. To cut a very long-winded and not entirely relevant as short as I can, a dodgy antiques dealer by the fabulous name of James Piggy Malone was arrested in 1988 after it was discovered that he ran a whole network of burglars. Upon his arrest, Piggy, we just have to call him that, started ranting and raving about how he knew that Ray Adams was bent as a 9-bob note, and he alleged that the corrupt police officer was very much in the pocket of the local notorious gangster Kenneth Noy. Sadly, no cool nickname for Kenneth Noy. At the time, he was behind bars for handling stolen goods and would later be in prison for murder during a road rage incident, which had occurred when he was on license from prison. Piggy initially seemed eager to spill the beans on Ray Adams and make an official statement, but then he curiously changed his mind. Although the anti-corruption unit investigated his earlier claims, it all seemed to go quiet when a police informant made a statement which declared that Piggy's accusations were all totally malicious and false. It seems that the word of this informant was accepted by the anti-corruption unit without question, and the CPS later ruled that Ray Adams had no case to answer. But here's where things get a bit confusing, as the police informant's real name was David Norris. But no, he wasn't the same person as convicted murderer David Norris, so to keep things simple, we'll now refer to him as John Tracy, an alias he often used to help hide his identity as a supergrass. But hang on, it's going to get confusing again. John Tracy shared more than just the same real name as convicted murderer David Norris. He also shared connections with the whole Norris family, including a special connection with Clifford Norris, the wealthy drug baron father of David Norris. John Tracy died in 1991, but the Metropolitan Police looked into this particular saga again in the year 2000 and compiled a top-secret report which went unseen until the good old BBC uncovered the document in November 2023. The report concluded that Ray Adams was indeed corrupt and that the informant John Tracy had either been coached by Ray Adams or another bent officer to deliver an utterly faultless performance. This had convinced the anti-corruption unit that aggrieved gangster Piggy Malone had been telling porkies all along. The top-secret report concluded that the testimony of informant John Tracy had been entirely fictitious and was part of a well-orchestrated attempt to discredit Piggy Malone as a witness and halt any further investigation into the Ben Ray Adams. Now, there's no suggestion, as yet, that Ray Adams, who retired the same year that Stephen Lawrence was murdered, impeded the murder investigation in any way, and so far his contribution to the case seems to be minimal. But it's a little worrying that both Ray Adams and the Metropolitan Police appear to have given misleading information about the police officer's relationship with dodgy contacts. Ray Adams was actually challenged about his crooked pals during the Macpherson inquiry in 1998. He refused to answer any questions on John Tracy as he felt it broke police protocol on informants. But this was an unconvincing argument, as it was now public knowledge that the deceased John Tracy had been an informer. He has also consistently denied over the years having a corrupt relationship with gangster Kenneth Noy. In a much later review of the allegations, published by the Metropolitan Police in 2012, it seems to be officially concluded that good old Ray Adams is clean as a whistle and barely even knew the informant John Tracy. Seems like a bit of a stretch there to... Really? However, this published report completely contradicts the earlier top secret report from 2000, which concludes that not only did Adams enjoy a significant relationship with John Tracy, but he also shared a long-standing, unhealthy, and corrupt relationship with that gangster Kenneth Noy, who did indeed appear to have Adams in his pocket. Completely clean as a whistle, was he? This means that a police officer who worked briefly on the Stephen Lawrence murder investigation was secretly deemed by the police to be corrupt and had either direct or indirect connections with the family of one of the suspects who was ultimately convicted for murder. And the Metropolitan Police appear to have hidden these alarming conclusions from the public when they published another report 12 years later. Not exactly inspiring confidence, is it? No, it is not, Danny. Apparently, the Lawrence family had always viewed the involvement of Ray Adams in the investigation with deep suspicion. Following the BBC's discovery of the documents, the family lawyer Imran Khan demanded that the Metropolitan Police apologize for withholding information on Ray Adams and misleading the Macpherson inquiry. There is also now fresh calls for yet another investigation into whether Ray Adams may have influenced the outcome of the murder investigation. Ray Adams is probably like, oh, for fuck's sake, I'm 81! Well, that's what happens when you're a bent copper, Ray. Allegedly. At the time of writing, the police have yet to respond to questions over the discovery of the documents, simply stating that they need to review more material before considering any further action. So, where else is there to go from here? Well, every time a new revelation hits the press, it usually leads to widespread calls to either reopen an investigation that was only recently closed, or launch yet another official inquiry, or at the very least give the police complaints department yet another rebranding and a fresh lick of paint. It does seem very odd that I'm writing a script on a case which is now 30 years old and yet is still yielding fresh discoveries and generating frequent dramatic headlines today. I dare say that new headlines may have already hit the press by the time this video is out in the wild, in which case I should say that I always expected PC Tricky Trotters McSquealer may have had something to do with it all along, and even after all this time, it does of course feel very much like an incomplete story, with only 2 people from a supposed gang of 6 having faced justice so far. If we come back to the story in another 30 years or so, maybe we'll have a little more progress into the conviction of the other suspects and the full exposure of any police who knowingly impeded this case in any way from 1993 onwards. Probably best if the police just give up the investigation, though. From the evidence so far, we're better off just leaving everything in the hands of the BBC and Channel 4, and the Daily Mail to stoke a little further. But what was it about the Stephen Lawrence murder that has managed to keep a hold of the public attention for all this time? As we said near the top of the video, he wasn't the only black person to have been brutally murdered on the streets in a racially motivated attack that wasn't met with full justice, yet so many of the other equally appalling cases faded away from public memory relatively quickly, whilst the anger invoked by the Stephen Lawrence murder has carried on burning for 3 decades. If you believe the Daily Mail, it's all down to them. After Gary Dobson and David Norris were found guilty of murder in 2012, the paper's former editor, Paul Dacher, seemed happy to take much of the credit for the convictions. He observed, "I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that if it hadn't been for the Mail's murderers headline in 1997 and our years of campaigning, none of this would have happened." We have to remember that Paul Dacher also admitted that he may not have run the headline at all if Neville Lawrence hadn't just carried out some truly excellent plastering at his home. And again, I just say I don't think that's relevant. It's like, yeah, he got a story from somewhere and he ran with it. I think, credit to Paul Dacher here, honestly. Do I think he's entirely responsible? No, of course not. Do I think he stoked further and stuff to get progress? Yes, definitely. Good for you, Paul. Again, Daily Mail, the Daily Mail, but this was some good shit. It's also worth pointing out that prior to the bold murderers headline, the Daily Mail had run several pieces which displayed quite hostile attitudes towards the Lawrence family and the anti-racist campaigners who dared to suggest that our beloved and infallible British police force might have been in the wrong. Wow, okay, that's more on brand for the Daily Mail, isn't it? That's not to take anything away from the unprecedented step taken by the Daily Mail when they ran with such a controversial and potentially libelous headline, which certainly got people talking. But there were a lot of other factors involved in helping keep the Stephen Lawrence murder on the front page for so long. Right from the beginning, an anti-racist campaigner by the name of Mark Wadsworth had gone out of his way to ensure that every reporter in the land knew about Stephen Lawrence's good character. It seems appalling now that this was even necessary, but the concern was that because the murder victim was black, the national press, and indeed the general public, may have just assumed that he was a drug dealer or a gang member who got killed fighting over territory. Mark Wadsworth was one of many campaigners who helped get the message through to the press that Stephen Lawrence was actually a perfectly innocent, everyday teenager who had just been trying to get the bus home, and it was imperative that his murderers were caught. Good for you, Mark. You sound like a legend. The campaigns and investigations carried out over the years by the Daily Mail, the BBC, Channel 4 and The Guardian have all played a big part in not only keeping this case alive, but also uncovering some of the evidence which the police had spectacularly failed to find. Love it. Absolutely love it. I love it when journalism is like this. Other key players include Nelson Mandela, who drove a fresh wave of early publicity during that visit to the UK when he showed more concern for the Lawrence family than the serving government ever bothered to muster, and the incoming Home Secretary Jack Straw, who in 1997 took the step of launching a judicial inquiry which led to the game-changing conclusions reached by the Macpherson report. But the biggest credit of all must go to the Right Honourable Baroness Doreen Lawrence OBE and Dr. Neville Lawrence OBE, who never once gave up their relentless fight for justice. It must have felt as if they were battling insurmountable odds when they were challenging a botched investigation from a self-protecting police force that was more interested in withholding information and watching their own backs than taking any responsibility for their actions. The Lawrence family are still persevering in their long fight, which continues to this day. The name Stephen Lawrence now seems to be synonymous with the legacy of the sweeping changes to law, race relations, and policing that were a direct result of his death. Amongst many other things, the murder and subsequent investigation led to the reform of a police force that were exposed as institutionally racist, a wider reform of public bodies, and the axing of an 800-year-old law. And so many of these changes have been hugely positive, perhaps even helping to change the manner in which we try to understand racism. As one of Stephen's cousins, Matthew Bickley, puts it, there is the England before Stephen Lawrence and the England after. An annual Stephen Lawrence Memorial Day was launched in 2019 by then Prime Minister Theresa May to commemorate the legacy of the teenager. At the most recent event, held on April 22, 2023, the serving Prime Minister Rishi Sunak notably failed to turn up for his scheduled reading. But the serving Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, took the opportunity on the day to declare that while some positive progress had been made, he felt that the Metropolitan Police was still an institutionally racist organisation. It's certainly true that the impact of the murder didn't exactly help cure racism in the UK or shape a perfect police force and a wholly fair legal system. No, but we can't expect it to. These things don't happen overnight, and it's just a slow march towards equality. Eventually. Definitely not there yet. A 2018 report from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary found that almost exactly half of all reported hate crimes are dealt with inadequately. And whilst the use of stop and search has decreased significantly in recent years, there's still a disproportionately high number of black people getting stopped on grounds of reasonable suspicion. In fact, black people are still 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people. People of colour are also more likely to be found guilty of indictable offences and likely to receive a longer prison sentence than a white person. There's clearly a lot more work to be done. But I think it's also important that we remember that Stephen Lawrence was a person whose life was brutally taken at the age of just 18. Not just a murder victim, whose death proved to be a catalyst for change. Doreen Lawrence believes that Stephen would be impressed by the legacy of his name and the mark that he left on the UK, but she also wants people to remember that Stephen Lawrence was a human being. We'll leave the final word today to the Baroness, quote, I want people to think of Stephen other than as a black teenager murdered in a racist attack in southeast London in April 1993. I know that's the fact, but I now want people to remember him as a bright young man who any parent of whatever background would have been proud of. He was a well-loved, wonderful son and a shining example of what any parent would want in a child. Hopefully now he can rest in peace. Well said. And for a case that I've heard the name of so many times and was a little bit before my time, although a lot of this investigation more recently is just ignorance on my part, I'm glad I know more about this, and I'm glad I know more about the corruption and the institutional racism. That's because I don't know, the headlines are often so full of America for this, even internationally. But it's a problem. It's a problem in so many places. I don't really know what else to add to that. It's not really my place, I suppose. But thanks for being here. Hope you found this episode interesting, and I'll see you next time.